All right, so let's go ahead and get back to where we were at with insurance. Before we jump into the more of the, I think you've heard us say the disaster readiness plan. We've said COOP plan in the emergency management world. They say COOP plan a lot. It's the continuity of operations. I obviously have not had any more caffeine. So with that said, I wanted to first close out a little bit more on insurance with Kenton, because we really didn't talk about like peril-specific insurances and those secondary perils. So Kenton, can you just give us a little bit of insight when it comes to disaster or peril-specific insurance and what that secondary looks like? Is that insurance coverage we should be worried about? What does that, how do we have those conversations?
Great set of questions there, and I'll do my best to kind of unpack it a little bit. I think that the much of what I said earlier still applies to this part of the conversation too, because there is no standard policy, especially in the specialty lines market. You're shopping for coverage. It's difficult to get, especially in the current market environment. And it's really important for you to explore. The onus is kind of on you, and if you have a broker, on your broker, to have a really good understanding of what your needs are and which of those things make sense for you to purchase. I don't know specifically if you can buy a policy in the specialty lines market for a public housing authority related housing or Section 8 housing facility that's going to have everything in it all wrapped up in one policy. It could be that you have to find your liability policy, your property damage policy, and then add things to it like insurance coverage or flood coverage. I can tell you that in the home and business admitted market, those things are never included, and you do have to buy them separately. So the availability of that coverage is going to vary. I saw a lot of hands up for really old buildings. If your old building is made of masonry, it's probably going to be a lot harder for you to get affordable earthquake coverage than if you have a wood structure, because masonry structures are more likely to, especially older ones that haven't been retrofitted, are more likely to be a total loss if there's a significant earthquake. Wood structure homes are less prone to being a total loss after an earthquake. But the age matters, the location matters. So let me put it this way. I think there are some things that are sort of across the board true of insurance regardless of what market you're in. And those things are, you know, the insurance industry is acting in a certain way because of a lot of things that are happening that I mentioned earlier. Construction costs have gone up 55%, you know, much higher than the rate of inflation for the rest of the economy over the last 3 years. You know, property damage is up due to everything from civil unrest to wildfires to hurricanes and all the other things. So these things combine to increase the cost. The severity of the damage when it occurs is worse than it was. Even when there isn't an increase in the number of events, the cost goes up and the severity of what's happening to them goes up because of these climate change related issues. On a broad scale, what that means is that the industry is looking at all that and saying, what's my place in this market? How much risk can I afford to take on? And that's going to differ from company to company. And when we're talking about the specialty lines market, we're often talking about companies that aren't located in the United States even. They're in Bermuda. They're in other countries. So you're working perhaps with a local agent or broker who's helping you find that coverage, but that company is not here. And they're looking at risk maps that are developed by vendors for insurance companies. And sometimes there have been in the past in the hurricane region of our country, the Gulf Coast and Florida, there have been questions from regulators and consumer groups about the accuracy of the maps. Wildfire maps are evolving to become more accurate than they have been in the past, and they take in everything in consideration from the topography to the climate to the fuel load and what kind of vegetation is there, how close it is to the built community that it surrounds, the ability of the local firefighting agency to fight a large-scale conflagration if that occurs, whether or not it's a full-time municipal fire department or a volunteer fire department, and the state of the equipment they have. All these things are considered as these risk maps are put together. Different from hurricane. I'm not as familiar with that because we don't cover that, and it doesn't happen here a lot. So But in the wildfire space, all that's happening. So what I'm trying to get to is that there are broad industry risks that the industry responds to, because nobody wants to be the last guy insuring properties in a place, right? That's what happens to the Florida Fair Plan. That's what happens to the California Fair Plan, where they've got, multi-100% increase in people applying for policies. The Florida Fair Plan was about to go broke because it had taken on, it was the only place for people to get property insurance in Florida. And because all the other insurers left, they're trying to get insurers to come back into that market. So then on an individual basis, like I said, nobody wants to be the last insurer writing, and they have to look at their own. I mean, these are, sometimes they're privately held companies, sometimes in my marketplace, there are a lot of them are mutual companies. They're owned by their policyholders. But some are also stock companies. They're traded publicly, and they have to report to their shareholders. So there's a lot of things that influence each individual company's decision. So what that leads us to is the policy form itself. What does your policy cover or not cover? That's going to vary from company to company depending on their appetite for risk and how much they think they can reasonably charge, make a profit, and have enough in reserve to pay for a loss. So what that means is if there's an earthquake and there's a fire following the earthquake, if you don't have earthquake coverage, you might not have coverage for the fire that follows the earthquake if it was caused by the earthquake. If another structure caught fire and that caught your structure on fire, you might be covered because that's a fire. The earthquake didn't cause the fire on your property. One way to look at it is, as we've heard here today, that it's the insurance company protecting itself. But I have to say, in defense of the industry, what they are trying to do is make sure they have enough money to pay the claims, and they're not paying claims that they didn't intend to pay. Because if they have to start paying claims that they didn't intend to pay, then people haven't really paid for that coverage, and now the insurer is out a lot more money, and the next time they write a policy, it'll either be more restrictive or a lot more expensive. So that's how the insurer looks at it. We have to know what our risk is, and we have to know what we have to charge for it. That builds in the cost of a huge loss or being able to stay afloat and profitable. So
that's really interesting because Joel, when he went over earthquakes earlier, talked about how there can be flooding or water as a result of an earthquake. So if you do not have flood insurance, however, it's the result of an earthquake, it would be covered under that earthquake policy.
Right. You might be able to, you probably can find earthquake coverage that includes tsunami, but tsunamis are floods. So regardless of the cause of the flood, most people who have a homeowners or business policy, if a line breaks inside the building and it floods, you're covered. If the line from the city water system to your place breaks, you might not be covered unless you have coverage for that section of line. And if it's a flood from rain or hurricane or what have you, a tsunami, it's not covered unless you have flood insurance. So again, the lesson here is I haven't read my own insurance policy thoroughly. I understand insurance fairly well, but I don't read it myself. But I do call my insurance agent and remind myself about once or twice a year and say, if this happens, is this covered? Or, my daughter moved back in and she's going to drive my car. It's not different for any of you. And if you don't want to take the time to, go to insurance school and understand, be in the industry for 25 years, work with someone who does do that and who can explain your policy in layman's terms in a way that you can understand. Because you really don't want to be surprised by what's not covered.
Really important.
Does anyone have questions when it comes to insurance? Because this is a time where you have someone that can kind of navigate this for you. Yes?
Are those maps publicly available? I've heard them referenced, but never really got there.
So are the maps that the insurance agencies use available?
Yes, they are, in fact. The vendors that make the maps can make those available to people who ask for them. So like in particular, if your insurer, as an example, said, we're not going to renew your policy because you've got a score of 8, whatever their scoring system is, and that's too high for us, that's too high of a risk. And you said, well, what's that based on? They said, well, we got this score from this vendor. You could go to the vendor, it's going to be like ISO, Verisk, or one of the other companies, Washington Surveying and Rating Bureau. They produce these for the insurance companies, and they will show you your property and what its score is, and you can dispute it and say, no, you don't know this because you haven't been out in 5 years, but I actually, took the wood fence that adjoined my house out, and I changed the wood deck to a fire retardant deck, and I don't have any trees up against the house anymore. That kind of thing. That's possible to do. I want to add two more things about risk maps. One is that year before last, the state of Oregon produced a wildfire risk map as part of legislation that had been enacted the previous year, and it was the rollout of it was a complete disaster because they rolled it out and they called it a wildfire risk map, and they said in the letter that they sent to homeowners telling them where they sit on the map, they said we may at some point require you to mitigate the property around your parcel so that you're less of a risk of wildfire. Well, I mean, people just went nuts about the state telling them that they might have to do this, and they said the wildfire risk map was wildly inaccurate and all these other problems. Around that same time, insurance companies were beginning this process that we're seeing now on a kind of widespread basis of non-renewing coverage and or raising premiums because of the natural disasters that are occurring all across the country that they're losing billions of dollars on. So the people of Oregon were furious, pitchforks, torches, the whole thing, and said, you know, this is terrible. And so the legislature did two things. One, they banned insurance companies from using the state's wildfire risk map, which we never did. We never saw it. We didn't look at it. We have more sophisticated maps than the state does. We have anything to do with it, but we cannot convince anyone of that. Maybe outside this room. Maybe, I hope I've talked to you. But they have their own maps. They don't need the state's map. Then they withdrew the map entirely, and they're redoing it. Washington has also been directed. The DNR is working on a wildfire risk map for Washington State. I don't know if the result's going to be any different here when it comes out. It's important to remember, as we've been talking about, there are problems here that are a lot bigger than insurance. And insurance is really an important and critical issue for all of you, as it is for all homeowners and business owners across the country and here in the Northwest. But we don't start the fires. We help pay after the fires have destroyed stuff. You know, there is a whole bunch of things that public policy needs to address, that communities need to address, that homeowners and property owners need to address. Everyone has a role in this. And as I said earlier, when we start learning to live with wildfire and other disasters and prepare for them, then we'll be in better shape. And the insurance market will get better as insurers have more confidence in what their risk looks like. That's what they're afraid of, is what they don't know, the unknown unknowns, as they say.
Something that comes to mind for me when we've been talking about mitigation, we've talked about insurance, but it's also the part of what you can control and what you cannot control. And so one of the things that may be in your area is that there is a higher risk for wildfire in your area, and it's something that's another entity owns, or it's public space. But it sounds like understanding your stakeholders and advocating might be something as well. So something I'm very much aware of is you can create fire breaks in vegetation and brush and in forests, and essentially it makes it so, I mean, a 50-mile-an-hour wind would probably still thrust members over to that other side, but if you create these fire breaks, it's a mitigation measure that can be taken so that way it mitigates the potential spread of wildfires. So what are your thoughts on that, and being able to be involved in your local community to also identify some of these things to lower the risk?
Yeah. I would suggest it's a great idea, and one that I would encourage you all to do, not just locally with city council or town council, but also I can assure you that because the incidence of wildfire is so great and prevalent lately, that your state legislatures are thinking about what they can do, and as a collective, if you all were to come together, think about what are some of the public policy measures that you would want the legislature to take as they're considering some of these things that they're looking to do. I would encourage you all to collectively, advocate to the legislature on your behalf for those things. I know and join with related organizations. So like your Association of Home Builders and the Realtors, right? They're going to have there'll be some commonality in the interest that you all have. And I think advocating as a group collectively would really, really support you all in getting in a better place.
Yeah, I'd like to throw out a couple things too that are happening in this space that I think are really important for where we head in the future. all three of the legislatures that I work with, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, all had legislation this last session to establish some kind of program for mitigation grants, which is money from the state that would go out to property owners, both on the commercial side and on the private property side, that would help people do the defensible space work and mitigation work. It doesn't always have to be a new roof, that's made of metal. It can be simpler things like making sure the mesh screen on your soffits are small enough to not allow embers to come in, retrofitting some things like that. But there are also major discussions in Idaho around the idea of a reinsurance risk pool. So like what I was talking about earlier, the state establishes a board that operates kind of like a fair plan, except it says we'll kick in if all the insurers who want to participate in this risk pool, they cede some of their risk. You've got a $5 million property. You insure the first $3 million, and if it goes above that, this pool pays the rest. And the insurers would be required to kick into that pool if it didn't generate enough money from existing premium taxes and that sort of stuff. So that's one idea that's out there. The mitigation grants are on discussion in all three of the states. In fact, I'll be at a meeting in Bend in June to talk about a mitigation grant program for the state of Oregon. So there's just a lot of effort going into this. There's also a thing called the Data Commons Project, which is run by Milliman, and it involves the Western Fire Chiefs Association, Cal Poly. I went to a meeting in California where they talked about how do we take the ideas around defensible space for a property and expand it to a community. Mm-hmm. How do we take the science of wildfire and how we know how fires move based on topography and wind patterns and fuel load and all that? How do we decide, okay, we can't afford to rebuild every community. We can't afford to retrofit every community. We can build new communities more smartly. But when you have an existing community, like say Paradise, which homes are going to be the first homes to go? So those homes can be retrofitted first, and they don't become kindling for the next house behind them. That kind of science and those kinds of discussions are going to be, the next 10 years are going to change a lot of things, I think, around in that space. And hopefully, you folks will also be involved in those discussions.
Karen?
So if you're doing a renovation or new construction, are there going to have some sort of requirement for these, for the permitting process, do you know, to have these put in place to encourage that mitigation?
Right. So the WUI codes, the WUI building codes, were supposed to be adopted this year by the State Building Code Council, but they recently voted to hold off for another year. So there are existing requirements, but they're being updated, and I think they decided that, first of all, there was pushback from local communities that said, you're imposing these building codes on us and it's going to cost a fortune. Right. Developers and builders are concerned about those costs as well. But it's a delay. It will eventually happen that these WUI codes in the state, national, and global building codes will be updated to include some of these defensible space-related measures.
Yeah, human agency does have a huge impact. I remember when I was working in the Obama administration, we sometimes would get called on to help with international disasters that happened. So in the same year, there were earthquakes in China, in Haiti, and in Argentina. Argentina had strong building codes because I can't remember when it was, but sometime in the early 20th century, they had, or mid 20th century, they had a really bad earthquake. And it was the strongest of the three, as I recall, but the least amount of damage, right? Simply because they had really strict building codes that were put in place to help with mitigating future disasters. So I know a lot of times there's pushback, especially sometimes even from home builders and folks like that, because of the cost associated with it, and they'll be the ones that are telling the legislature, no, don't put in these new requirements. Locally, building codes most times are where your building codes are put in place. Don't put in these new requirements because it's going to increase the cost of building. But it is extremely impactful on how well your community recovers or is impacted by a disaster when it happens. So I'd encourage you all to think about it collectively, think about it individually, work collectively, and try to get some of these things put in place.
Thank you. So one thing I just want to highlight before we move into the COOP plan is Trevor Jordan will be here tomorrow with FEMA Region, and I think it'll be really important to ask him some of these questions as well when it comes to the funding available. I can't stress enough that there's a lot of mitigation funding out there right now between the BRIC grants, which is building resilient infrastructure in communities, as well as HMA, some of the other HMA grants when it comes to, I guess, flood mitigation wouldn't
So
be-
I could go real quickly for the different
Yeah.
hazard mitigation funding streams. So there's a hazard mitigation grant program that's tied to a disaster, and we also use fire declaration. We get a federal FEMA or a fire management assistance grant through the summer. We got, and that's based on per fire. We got 8 of those last year. So each of those are different funding streams related to like an event. The BRIC, building resilient infrastructures and communities, that's an annual competitive round.
Yep.
Where we projects in the state compete against other states or jurisdictions for funding. We have flood management assistance grants, so it allows for like buyouts and elevations of properties in the floodplain. There's a new one we just got $20 million in the state of Washington for, was Operation Swift Current, which is basically another version of the floodplain management thing. That's actually dedicated. FMA is normally competitive. This is actually for the state. We're trying to figure out what that means. It's a brand new program, but some will come out on that. But that'll be around your severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss properties within the NFIP insurance program. So if you know what I'm talking about, you know those acronyms. Our National Flood Insurance Program is the one federally ran insurance program in the nation. FEMA, and I think Trevor can talk to you a little bit. That's kind of not necessarily in his lane. I do a little bit more of that at the state level. So those are the big ones, but we also, under those categories are specific, under BRIC, there's specific programs for building codes. Like this year, they opened up a state set aside so we could get up to $2 million in state grants within the state to get after building codes. So building code improvement. So in your local jurisdictions, funding to like look to apply the new building standards to your actual local codes and to the state. So that's hopefully something that'll continue in the future. We did some state level and some local jurisdiction programs because it was short notice opportunity to look at like across the state how we can best fit that. But hopefully next year that opens up again and we can open up a little bit more time for the local jurisdictions. So those
Thank
are some
you.
of them.
For those of you not from Washington, HMGP, BRIC, those are nationwide.
Yep.
Your states will have those. Some of the ones that he mentioned that are Washington specific, you may have something akin to that in your states. I would encourage you, reach out to people who run the programs at the state level and ask.
And we'll deep dive a lot into this more in tomorrow and under recovery, but when you receive the slide deck, one of the ending slides is a bunch of resources with links. You can also Google for your state hazard mitigation officer, nicknamed
His
Schmo
name is Tim Cook
for Washington.
for Washington.
But your SHMO, or State Hazard Mitigation Officer, that's a great point of contact to just ask what's available within your state. Become friendly with them. Maybe you'll even get on the short list of listserv when things come out and when that application period is. Or you have the conversation now so you can start planning before it's even open of being able to submit. I'm going to set low expectations on my experience. You're usually not selected your first time, but the good news is once you set up the application, you just resubmit it. And so there's other opportunities to be able to utilize that more than once. Also tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit more about the CDBG because there's now CDBG MIT, that mitigation grant as well. That's under HUD, which is one of the few, there's CDBG DR and there's CDBG MIT. And so we'll go over those more tomorrow, but other funding opportunities for us to discuss. I just want to make sure that historically PHAs are not involved in applying to any of these, but you're eligible. And so I can't stress it enough. It's a little bit of a lift, but again, once you have the application, you know what you want to do, why not? Also, when it comes to all these building codes, once you get in and your application's approved and it's allocated, depending on the program, some of them, if you're like, oh, it costs a little bit more because it was triggered building codes, some of that can be covered. So it's not like, why not? So again, we'll get more into that tomorrow. I just think it's very important that we hit on it consistently. So moving into the COOP plan, or the Continuity of Operations Plan, you'll hear it called a CONOP depending on the emergency manager, you'll hear CONOP, you'll hear COOP, you'll hear other planning types, but we're going to talk a little bit more of that. Essentially, that's what this disaster readiness plan is. This is like your COOP light. This is not all-inclusive. It does not have everything specific for you. It's just to get you thinking and get you started. So with that said, we've talked a lot about vulnerabilities, some things we did not talk about, and we'll probably ask FEMA a little bit more about community lifelines tomorrow. That's huge in the emergency management space. That's after disaster, knowing what they need to get on first. Your hospitals, your EMS, making sure that there's critical infrastructure and roads that are back so that we have passable ways to get to people. What does that look like for you for vulnerabilities? Do you have 40 bridges that you would pass between here and a hospital? If you know, a lot of you work with vulnerable populations, so what does it look like for medications? What does it look like for any other needs, energy needs, if it needs to be that there needs for oxygen or other medical needs? So just things to be thinking about as you're navigating your vulnerabilities. I think probably a vulnerability that we all have is lack of communication and preparedness now. Are you talking to your occupants and your residents and the population of people you work with to say, hey, here's the plan. This is great if you fill this out. If you do not communicate it, I'm so glad you had this mental exercise, but it's not going to help you long term. So that's something that I want to make sure that we're talking about as we navigate this. Also on page 21, we talk about agreements and contracts list. Knowing what you have in place now, whether it's agreements for sister housing authority agreements, sheltering partners, utilizing what the community has at the county or city level for sheltering, or developing your own. Transportation companies, if you need to move a mass amount of people, what does that look like, and can you get them on contract ahead of time? Repair services, debris removal, etc. So at that point, I'm going to turn it back to the panel for some questions. So Ed, specifically, what are some of the resources that you wish you had in place that you did not at the time and you've mitigated moving forward?
Just resources we didn't have in place. I think really the resources I most want to have is additional staff capacity, because one of the big hits we took was the staff that lost housing in the disaster who are no longer available to us. So we don't have a lot of redundancy in our staff, and it's not easy for us to go pick up talent like sitting in this room in a rural area. One of our challenges in recovery was actually how to restaff, because we couldn't recruit from outside our community. We had to find people who already lived in the community who had homes, because you couldn't bring anybody into the community. So again, staffing, really this idea of personnel capacity, Rod, probably is the first thing that comes to mind.
I'm curious, do you have a lot of policies and procedures drafted now that if you had to bring in staff, they could pick up to understand the expectations?
I think honestly I'd say no. I think the motivator in our agency, the common denominator is have employees buy into the mission. Because if you have complete buy-in to the mission, people will do whatever is necessary to defend and advocate for that mission. So really it starts with the buy-in. For an agency our size, other resources, gee, I wish I had a whole pile of plans on the shelf ready to go.
Right.
But you know, it's not really realistic. So again, we go back to this idea of personal accountability and the staffing that's needed.
Okay, that's helpful. Brad, any thoughts?
No, not this time.
So Joel, can you just talk through a little bit of exercises and drills and what they can look like, both at the PHA within their team level, as well as to be integrated in the community?
Okay.
We talked about tabletop, but I think more of just like what they can do and how simple or complex.
So I was thinking about that as well. So when people look at COOP planner, like the state of Washington has a COOP planner, like that's their job. They plan for the state, they help jurisdictions, so there's resources out there to assist you. But the biggest thing with COOP is just start, to get your mind wrapped there, start small. Like you can just say, okay, the water main broke on this building. What do we do for the next 2 days or today? You know what I mean? Start with a small problem set. You know what I mean? And from there, you're gonna walk through the process. Okay, I need to find a place we go. Okay, can we go remote? okay, I can go remote, but we have meetings in person, can we shift to another location? So just walk through a problem set like that, like, oh, we lost power, or they're gonna do construction on the road for a week and you can't get this. So start with a smaller kind of planning mission set, but you're gonna bring up all the, just thinking through that with your team, and just kind of shop talking it and whiteboarding it, as I like to do that as well. We got like 4 in my office. You kind of go through, and then you can look back and like, well, what did we address? And you're probably going to have addressed all the functional areas you need to look at on an overall plan. Then, so what you can do is kind of take that internal kind of guide plan that you looked at with your operations and expand on it. Okay, if this was a month, if this was 2 months, if it was a specific situation, if it wasn't just the offices would work at it, but it's our actual customers, our homes, and look at that problem set. So you can, again, you can, how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. So you can take that a lot of ways. And you can take some of the stuff you might already have in planning. Like you probably look back like, oh, during COVID, what did we do? Or when we did have a power outage in the building, what did we do? Or different facilities. And try to capture those lessons learned, because you might have already solved the problem in the past, or you know a neighbor that did as well, and kind of start building out. And that becomes your plan. It's like, ask the question,
Right.
and then what are your possible alternates? You know what I mean? For the state EMD, we got to be ready at any point in time. And I have 5 or 6 different buildings listed on our plan for alternate operating facilities, which includes next door to my current building, includes Idaho, it includes Spokane and other locations. But our problem in the state is that we have these plans, but we haven't set up anything on the other side. Do I have enough comms? Do I have all that stuff? So, but those are the questions. Those are the problems out of our COOP plan that we're solving now. Hey, we have a plan. We have a location identified. Now, what are the other things I need there? And is it, for us, is it an MOA or MOU with the local EM to provide services, or the active duty military or other people? Because ours is on the base out there in Spokane. So those are the kind of considerations. So you kind of, as you walk through, say, what are the options to answer that question? And so that's kind of the basic, the nutshell of kind of a COOP plan. What would you do? If our building breaks, if something goes on, kind of have a guideline. Again, a plan is just that, something to start off with, and you have the questions listed. Is this still a variable option, because maybe that building is also affected? Okay, do I have a secondary, or what considerations did I have for that building that I have to look for in another location? Those kind of stuff. Does that kind of break it down for you?
It does, but one thing I'm curious before we go to questions is, does Washington EM have a website or other training opportunities or resources of where they can even do online training?
Yes, I don't. I'll have to get those to you. Probably my internet is bad here, so probably
No worries.
tomorrow I'll see if I can track those down and get them out to the group here. We have our state's COOP plan. We do have individuals that can help assist in building your COOP plans, and your counties. And when we talk about your interconnectivity with your locals, they have like part of the comprehensive emergency management plan, the CEMP, is that do you have a COOP plan? The COOP plan is a component of that. So look at theirs, see what they have, because they'll have listed a lot of those questions. They'll have different concerns than what you have. But you can kind of take, again, like our friend said earlier, there's a lot of stuff out there, so take what you can,
Right.
scrub it out, make it your own. So that's kind of the start, and then there are other resources, and we have people within our agency that can help you with COOP planning or considerations, and I believe I have to look back at the FEMA training site. I think FEMA does have some
EMI,
stuff on this
yeah.
as well, an EMI, and those are self-paced courses or in-person courses as well.
Yeah, so FEMA EMI is, you can just Google it. It's the Emergency Management Institute. It's online IS courses, independent study courses. If you want to say you have a certification in something, they have certain programs you can just do online self-study, and then you get a certification if you'd like. But they have things on there like continuity of operations, training, drills, disaster specific. It goes from planning to response to preparedness to recovery. They hit it all. A lot of those are IS.
And they also have courses specifically for the state level, for the FEMA level, for the local level. And also they have a lot of times they have training for your electeds and other senior officials as well. Like if you want to get them smart and kind of what some of the stuff that you're doing as part of this initiative, there's some training that you can provide. And FEMA will even come out and do some of these trainings that we can do in person, or we have trainers in the state within my agencies and across the EM field in the state. They can come in and give training. A lot of those staff are certified and conduct the training locally.
and I'm not completely speaking for you, but a lot of the times they won't charge if it's a state, local support.
Look, it's your logistics that is what it's called. So the training is given for free. The FEMA stuff provided is just whatever logistics would take you to take the course. So in-person courses, that's what we try to, we do partners. There was a local EM course in Spokane a couple months ago that I actually spoke at while I was out there, and they had people from 5 or 6 different counties that drove in, did the training for the week, and went home. So that's kind of stuff. But yeah, the cost, there's no cost for the course itself that I'm tracking at all.
That's my understanding. Yes, Ed?
Just a comment. I'm sitting here thinking, I can't say that I have a disaster, any kind of preparedness plan, but I will tell you that nothing would have prepared us for the kind of disaster we confronted. It was the largest disaster in the history of the United States. So lessons learned, I'm glad you're here, because one of the things to take away are expectations. In conversation with the folks in Lahaina, Hawaii, who also had their community wiped out, one of the first things I told them is expectations. Your community is going to want to see your displaced people disappear in about 6 months. Their patience will last about 6 months. The reality of your situation is those displaced people will probably be there for 3 to 6 to 10 years, if not 30 years, to unwind. So you have this disconnect between community expectations and the reality of the situation, given no housing opportunity. So, nothing. I would have loved to have had a plan, but and now I could see where a plan might make sense. But no one had ever encountered a disaster where you lost 15% of your jurisdiction's housing stock, which is crazy.
No, 100%. Yes. I'll say you were first, and then there was one behind you and one behind you. Oh, sorry. Yes, please. Okay.
So in Bremerton, we struggle with a good amount of vendors that do certain things. And we're struggling on trying to find ways that we can bring more vendors in that are willing to work in Bremerton. Has anybody else experienced that in their communities?
I'll let the panel answer first, but I have a couple thoughts. As far as having a hard time identifying
Like
vendors.
Oh, so you're looking for like contract vendors for like the
So
support
putting
service.
out potential RFPs, RFQs, or trying to find the work, or you have a need, however, finding vendors to respond to it, to
Yeah.
be able to support the need.
Or even the restoration piece, so you've got all the different steps that go with mitigation, packing the resident up, moving them, things like that. It has been a challenge.
Any thoughts on that from the panel?
In rural areas, I usually find the ecumenical groups are the ones that can step in and help out, volunteer basis. As far as professional capacity, usually we have to work with other housing authorities in alliance. We develop a portfolio of consultants that can work across the state. We do that often through NARO.
I was going to lean on working with other organizations or other partners, being able to bring a larger portfolio of work is sometimes very appetizing to any vendors wanting to respond. There's also the opportunities for P3 or public-private partnerships, so being able to reach out to a potential private partner that might have a vested interest long-term in that area is also another opportunity.
And then on some of the FEMA programs, they do offer like technical assistance. I know the state, we do as well, different programs, and they're specific under like mitigation, there's specific technical assistance for like the benefit cost analysis and things of those nature that FEMA can provide. And other agencies, but I know in the state, if you're looking at a mitigation project, my team will help you walk through building the process, because we're just as much invested in you getting that program as you are probably. So we want to continue this process.
Okay, thank you.
Felicia, I'm curious, does the PIH procurement rules allow for housing authorities to contract together? So a bunch of smaller housing authorities have any issue that they're having in Bremerton to issue a big task order contract and then sort of pay in as they use it?
So I'll do this much and then I'll find out the answer for the bigger.
Okay.
That's why I have to specialize this. But for procurement, there are some exceptions to.
For cooperative purchasing,
Yes,
yep.
for through a cooperative agreement, through just, looking at some things. So we do have rules that will allow similar type things.
Yeah.
The bigger pieces, making sure that you follow the procurement.
Right.
2
Yes.
CFR 200 all day.
Yeah. Yes.
And the nuances kind
Yep, yep.
So there's two ways we've taken advantage of that. One, we've contracted groups of housing authorities contracting single contractors through a joint powers authority. That's one way to do it. The other is for a lead housing authority to develop a consulting relationship, and then housing authorities for a period of time can piggyback on that original procurement and join in.
We actually just did something similar for our receivership PHAs, right? Where housing authority in different states. That's why I said there's nuances, but we follow procurement rules.
And trust but verify before you move forward spending money.
Our friends, not so much our friends, but friends, OIG, right?
Yeah, right.
Friends.
Right.
But these are the types of things that get PHAs.
Right.
We're trying to do good, we're trying to do it quickly, and, 3 years from now, when the IG comes in, they look at your books, they look at your records, they say, you might have done good, but you didn't do it right. And so that is where your field office teams come in.
Yep.
They don't know, they will forward the questions to our headquarters team, where we have SMEs, but we get it, you're trying to deal with livelihoods and do things quickly, so we do try to expedite those processes, but we've seen, the pieces, yes, follow the cartoons, to a, 200, following the procurement rules, but absolutely, when you have opportunities to leverage that someone else has already followed the process properly, and
Right.
build on that, that's something that's really good.
Completely agree.
I was just gonna make for all of you who are in Washington, just make a really quick plug for Washington State EMD. In a previous role at the University of Washington, we needed some major consultation and assistance, and just incredible the patient, thoughtful guidance, providing resources, offering to follow up, come out and meet with us. Like, I can't say enough good things.
Did he buy your lunch?
I actually had lunch with him, but he bought us a- Thank you. But again, we're one agency, and we are here to support and just for planning factors for staff capabilities. We support all 39 counties and 29 federally recognized tribes in the state. So let us know early on, and we can definitely see what we can do to assist you or plug you in with other partners. And we do that a lot of time. Like, oh, you have a specific problem set. Oh, we help so and so that's willing to help others, and we get you guys connected in.
Felicia, do you have any comments?
I had a comment here, but I wanted to make sure other folks that have raised their hand.
I think
So I wanted to go back to something that you said and also, Ed also said, and that was about the community and sharing. So part of having a plan, one piece or component of your plan should actually absolutely educate. And you heard me say, people will call us when the event happens, they say, what's HUD gonna do? And we are a partner in this, but our PHAs are first up, your local community leaders are first up, and so the more that you can educate your community leaders about the role of the housing authority, educate your landlords about their role as a landlord, receiving funding and having renters that they then become responsible for if something happens, but ultimately, and then educate your residents. The role of education throughout the planning process, throughout the response process is absolutely critical, and that also saves you time. So when folks are calling your phone and you're in this chaotic state because, you never would have planned for a catastrophe like an entire town, right, having to deal with loss and fire, people already know who's on first, and well, this is what I depend on the executive director of the housing authority on. Let me reach out to them. Here's what I can depend on, the next report. So that education piece and joining in on meetings that your city has, you hear they're having that emergency management meeting, attending that meeting in the
Yes.
space that in the seat that you sit in, so that then your residents can be informed. Making sure kind of every quarter or so, or at least biannually, your residents understand this is what we do in these cases. Because when you're filling out the application, they just want you to use it, right? So you can have all those things, but that doesn't matter until the event happens, and they're like, well, nobody told me I was supposed to be documented when we came across the TV. So it's just critically important to have education as a part of your plan.
No, thank you for
Amen.
that, Felicia. And it is critical at all levels, not just within the PHA. One of the things that I would really encourage you to do, again, when you're reaching out to your locals, is you can also, I don't know what your listservs look like for your residents, for your landlords, but put that information out. If there's a lot of public sessions when it comes to when they're updating their plans, they need that public comment period. Send it out, inform them so that they have that opportunity. One thing we haven't talked as much about here, and I think it's due to lack of experience currently in Washington, for good. It's good that you don't have this experience yet, but what that logistics look like for both logistics for evacuation and logistics for sheltering. I know that the planning's probably good, but we do have some really good experts on the panel that have been through what that looks like, and I want to take a moment for us to talk through this. So as you're filling out your COOP plan and your workbook, you're thinking through what works, what doesn't work, or what you need to find more information about.
A couple of things on that I will say. Earlier, I think I was looking for the name Organization Council on Aging. To be someone that you reach out to in advance, they can provide all types of resources when a disaster happens, but they need to know who you are and what it is you expect, and who to expect a call from for assistance. Transporting people, we mentioned in a slide earlier, pre-positioning transportation contracts, right? If you have to evacuate all of your residents from a place and they don't have reliable transportation of their own, or can't because of the time of the month it is, and the checks haven't come in quite yet. I mean, these are realities, right? Might not have the money to even be able to fill up the cars to get it to wherever or know where to go. And so that the transportation pre-positioning contracts there, coordinating with your local and state folks on sheltering. If you need to move people, where can you move the people to? Those things need to be known in advance, depending upon what type of disaster it is, forest fire or earthquake, and where the impact is, where can you go safely? Again, thinking about the fire drill that we all did in school, third graders go in this corner, second graders on that corner, and so on and that type of thing needs to be understood. Some buildings, right, may have a policy because they were built in a way that it is safer to stay in your unit with the door closed and than it is to come out and try to evacuate in the event of a fire. Do your residents know that, right? If there's a fire, stay in. You're safe here. This building is not one that's going to burn down because of the way we built it. And somebody's going to come and check on you at some point when it's safe for you to come out, right? Those are the types of things that you all need to consider and make sure, as Alicia was saying, that you communicate it throughout your organization and with all the partners who will be impacted.
Okay, so Joel, what does it look like from a communication perspective at the state and local level if there were to need to be an evacuation, whether it's a fire or whether it's a tsunami?
So, like most things, the first line or the primary responsibility for evacuation is the local authority. So there are several different systems that we use across the state. We as the wireless emergency, I actually just read that acronym the other day. I can't remember. So it's the program for like alert messages that go through cells. But like for the LAHAR system, I'm going to give everybody a question. Who knows what a LAHAR is? Hey, you guys all must be in this now. So LAHAR, for those that don't understand, is a massive mudslide. That's like a tsunami of mud that comes from a volcanic eruption. So there are certain areas of the state. So we have a LAHAR siren network. We have the tsunami, the AHAB siren networks. And those are all generally controlled by the agencies that have them, but we have access at the state. So that's kind of how the alerting goes. It starts at the local level. But as a state, like if you need specific translation services that you don't have capability, we have some services to possibly support. We're trying to grow that. We're trying to, and get that out there. So that's kind of how the alerting happens. It generally starts at the local level. If there's a fire, they'll push at the local alert or an earthquake and go. And we actually have some pretty good pre-earthquake alert system. I still don't know how the science of that works. How do you know before an earthquake is going to happen? But there's actually great science there and technology we can do. And that's where you save lives. So you alert them early, you shake cover before it shakes, you get out of the building or what you need to do.
Do you guys have active social media that people should follow or it would be encouraged to follow? like the
Yeah, so
local-
Washington EMD, we're on Twitter, Facebook, or X now, and most of the other ones. So we have alerting systems there. DNR does a lot on the wildfire. They do a lot of their just kind of a notification there. But even my team, we track social media as we're tracking fires. So we track fires every summer with DNR. So we're like, oh, we heard about smoke, or we heard about a fire on Twitter, and then we start digging into it. So just for your community, stay plugged into your local services. Your local EM offices might not have a lot of bandwidth, but DNR does put out a lot of information in the summer. There's a couple for you guys. There's called Watch Duty is an app. It's a free app. It's all about fire watch. So if you, especially with the fire time of the season, if you want to kind of have an app that can tell, you can see what's going on in wildfires in your area. You can pull it up, you can dial in the map, you get very specifics on the fire, like how big it is it controlled or not controlled, give you kind of a preemptive kind of idea of what's out there in your space. So.
And then circling back with drills, I think they're really important. We've talked about education, training, and exercises, but figuring out high level if it's a plan, whether it's a water issue, whether it's a fire drill, but what happens if it is an earthquake or a wildfire, make sure you're educating out to your occupants what that might look like or what they could do once you've established a plan, and getting the information from your local EM is very important. I think a lesson learned from Hawaii, many lessons learned, but I think one of the big things is they had a siren protocol in place, but they did not exercise it. So they were actually nervous to utilize the siren as a notification because they were afraid of where people would go since they had not been doing exercises or drills.
Yeah, and we could talk about that a little bit because and it's something we're doing with our AHAB sirens or the other different siren systems we have, is to, besides just put out the siren, put out other information. This is a fire evacuation or other community, because they're big speaker systems. So that was expected. They had that capability. They had never practiced it. They didn't action it. So we're trying to action it here.
So I think that's a big lesson learned about something that is really relevant, something that just happened, and it did definitely impacted the amount of casualties because it was not something that was practiced, was not exercised, and they did not know what that looked like. So when you heard Joel speaking on how it works in specifically Washington, I'm sure Alaska has something similarly with Oregon, is understanding what's in place, what are those warnings, and what do they mean, so that way you're empowering the people that you are impacting and educating on what they can be doing correctly. I have a question up front.
Yes, actually it's more a comment, and I first want to say thank you for this. This is a tool. This will become our agency's firewall, because we live in a very fire-prone community, and we're in 2014, 2015, we lost over 400 homes that we're still trying to recover from. Every year, fire is not if it's going to happen, it is when. While we do have currently a disaster planned evacuation plan for our communities, we call communities our properties. We had an experience 2 years ago in one of our communities where there was level 3 fire evacuation, level 2, getting ready to go. Our site managers are working with our 16 seniors. This is what we do. We practice with them in the summer, before the summer, what to do, fire exit and everything else. And we do have contact information up in the cloud so we can access it, anyone can access it from the agency. But when that last call, evacuation level 1, get out, nobody wanted to leave.
Yeah.
No one, not even one person. And even family members of these elderly people, they were showing up in the doors, let's go, let's evacuate.
Right.
No, this is where I'm going to be, I have lived here 20 years, I'm going to die, I'm going to die here.
Right.
So, now we are putting aside the PHA role. Let me be the landlord. As a landlord, to my knowledge in Washington State, we're very limited to what we can perhaps foreseen as force our tenants to do.
Right.
So what do we do?
That's a great question. It's something that I'm very familiar with from my work on the East Coast previously in hurricane realm, and I think you can always involve law enforcement, but a lot of it's just having the conversations now to educate. It's also you're not just putting your life at risk, you're putting first responders at risk, you're putting EMS at risk. And are you prepared for that? Are you prepared to risk someone else's life to come try and save yours if something happens? And that's the conversations you can have during trainings and exercises. I've worked with a lot of governors. It's very unique when they're asked that question of what happens if they don't evacuate. I've had a governor say, "You gonna get wet from a hurricane." And I'm like, that's true. But I've also hired another governor. That's a direct quote. But then another governor say the same thing, like, okay, so you're not evacuating. For some of them, it's just another fire. It's just another hurricane. We always have this. It's never going to happen to me, or if it does, I'll deal with it when it gets close enough. You're saying level 1. You're just being risk averse. I got another 24 hours before I have to really decide. And the honest question, well, that is your choice, but are you willing to risk other people's lives and first responders and EMS to come try and rescue you? Because that is very selfish.
I know in the hurricane situation, when they order an evacuation and people don't, local leaders, sometimes state leaders will say, if you don't leave by this point, just write your name and social security number on your arm so we can identify your body.
But sometimes
Because-
it's that serious conversation of, it's not just about you. If it is, and this is your choice, this is your choice. And we're very proud in America, the fact that we get to kind of make our own decisions. But are you prepared to take that on?
And then to highlight your thing, I think agrees. I have some nods. In Washington State, the police cannot force you out of your so law enforcement can't actually move you out either. And so I think you go back like, well, if you get out now, we might not be able to come back and get you when you do need it. If you want us to come back later. And so that's kind of it. I mean, it is up to each individual. And usually that's the sheriff who's kind of in the leadership that's kind of, directing the evacuations. But yeah, it's sticky.
Yeah. Did I see a question? Yes.
Well, I was just going to, just moving back to one of the questions I asked earlier today, because the curriculum's kind of very mixed, so I want to make sure I understand it. They're not our citizens. We might care very deeply about them.
Yes.
Socially, they're our community. But that's a difference between me, for instance, as SHA in Seattle, providing housing and a landlord.
Yes.
And the city of Seattle being notified I have 50 residents, they refuse to evacuate. That now becomes a city problem.
Correct.
It eventually goes to the county. That's not mine to solve because I'm not here to solve it.
Correct. It is our job to plan, to communicate, identify what that looks like. And that's where you might be able to say now of, if you don't evacuate, and so this is the importance of this training and planning now is that you're really just educating, setting as many people up for success, because the reason a lot of you are all in this role is to be public servants, is to take care of the people the population that you have. And the best way to do that is to have the right tools.
But one of the things that upsets me the most about FEMA and disasters insofar as housing authorities concerned is that they believe that they have no responsibility to housing authority or their residents, that HUD's going to take care of them. You know, talk to HUD. Talk to HUD is what they'll say if you call them and say, hey, no, we're a public agency. We're eligible for FEMA public assistance. Someone, because they didn't sit in the room on the day that FEMA was having a training where they said no, their public housing agencies are eligible for public assistance. And guess what? The people who live in public housing are citizens of the United States of America, and they're eligible for FEMA individual assistance too, right? So oftentimes public housing authorities will get dismissed by FEMA, and I hate it. The other thing that they'll say is, and this is wrong. I mean, I was telling Ed that I fought the folks in after the campfire. They kept saying, the FEMA folks kept saying, well, CDBG will fix that. You can use CDBG for that. And their money is there. It is already appropriated by Congress to deal with disasters right then. The CDBG may come, it may not, it may be far insufficient to what the unmet needs are. And guess what? It usually comes about 2 years after the disaster, and it takes whoever's administering a year to set up the program. So if they're telling you HUD's going to take care of it and CDBG is going to deal with that, and you are dealing with current problems right as the disaster's happening, I'm going to
We'll talk about it
yeah, I'm not going to. Just tell them they're wrong.
So, but that,
A lot of fact sheets to that point.
Yeah.
That you're gonna hear about tomorrow. We're gonna go on. But because we know there's a lot of misconception on the FEMA side and so we work really hard to build those relationships. That's
Yes.
why you're gonna see them here tomorrow with folks from your area, because there are different flavors. It's like my field office, I got 44. You call a field office in Florida, you might get different flavors, for Janice and her team do. But at the end of the day, the goal is to make sure that our residents know they're eligible for home assistance, and make sure that our PHAs, if they are eligible for assistance, right, we gotta work with our insurance providers, and FEMA, and those things. So we've done a lot to create some actions around some of this, so that it makes it easier to kind of comprehend who's on first, whose money works, especially when there's a thing going on. You may be ready to pay for a bus to get people out. Well, but you gotta work with your local emergency management, because if they've already paid for the bus, you need them to bring their bus, because you can't use your funds for that, So
Right.
there's lots of different nuances.
Yep.
But you're like, really? Yes, really.
Yeah.
But it's knowing all of this before you get to that place.
Yes.
That's the key thing.
completely agree. Final thing when we're talking about educating and training, whether it's the fire levels, whether it's tornadoes, what the difference between a watch and a warning, and educating that. Again, I think it's very important for your staff, but also anyone that you're educating or impacting. A lot of this is just having the conversation. What's the difference between a watch and a warning? Which one's more serious? It's the same thing when it comes to the levels, right? So when are we not messing around? And the only way you're going to have people respond to that is educating and having these drills and exercises within reason. I think there is that balance of, it's the same thing that you probably deal with more with wildfires now that we deal with on the East Coast with hurricanes. Is they're happening so often now that people are like, meh, I've already been evacuated twice this year. I'm going to stay home this time. But that might be the one time. So that making sure the gravity of the situation is discussed is very, very important.
Can I add a piece here? And I thought about it earlier, but didn't fit, but I thought I'd add it down. So when we talk about like wildfire evacuation, there's another risk factor around wildfires, kind of like I talk about earthquake/tsunami, is wildfire smoke. So, and specifically with your vulnerable populations, that's a significant concern. So you might not normally evacuate people for like maybe there's a wildfire in the area and there's a lot of smoke. So hey, but you're not under evacuation, but it's unhealthy for people to be there. So those are some additional considerations we talk about planning around wildfire. So it's kind of like that secondary. Hey, we planned for wildfire, but now how do we plan for the wildfire smoke? And I know in the state we're rolling out a new grant program here hopefully soon. In the next couple of weeks for some state-funded money to help with sheltering for wildfire smoke. But that's kind of in infancy, but it's just looking at that other concern too. Hey, we're not at risk for wildfire, but the air quality's parts per million of 500 or something. We actually hit 650 at one jurisdiction last year. That's unhealthy for like cockroaches. But so having those planning factors, have maybe stockpile? Do you have some better filtration systems? Do you have locations pre-identified locations they can go to, like libraries and other public buildings to help? So those are kind of other considerations to make.
All right, Kent, you had a comment?
I just wanted to add that that's another point about insurance too, because insurance for homes and businesses, if you have to evacuate, even if your home hasn't burned, if you have to leave an area, there's insurance coverage for you to be put up in a hotel and that sort of thing. I don't know if there's a corollary to that in the specialty lines market for the insurance products that you're buying in the PHA marketplace, but it's a good thing to ask your broker about. If people had to be displaced from a facility that you're in charge of, is there coverage for, to help fund putting them up in hotel rooms or wherever they have to go?
Yes, some type of business continuity
Yeah.
type insurance you might consider. Especially, I mean, look, if you have a property that burns down, right? The funds that you're used to receiving from HUD to support that unit, that development may be in jeopardy, right? If you had a certain utilization of your voucher program and people are displaced because all the homes have burned down, right? And the fees that you're going to get for the foreseeable future from the voucher program will go down. What does that do to the number of staff? Do you have to lay people off? These are some of the questions. So you may be able to insure against some of those things by having a business continuity insurance policy. But it's also something that you probably want to think about in your plan, right? Nobody wants to lay folks off after a disaster, but if you just aren't going to have the work and the resources there to support it, then that becomes an issue.
All right, so I want to circle back to the COOP plan. I'm on pages 24, 25. We're going to be going into disaster response soon, but I kind of want to highlight why things are in here and why it's important. Starting with direction, control, and coordination, this is your personnel worksheet. A lot of this is pre-disaster responsibilities, and it goes a little bit into post-disaster. I understand we have some smaller PHAs here, and you might feel like your name's going to go down this whole column, which is very awkward. But something that we have learned in other parts of the country and how some of the other PHAs have operated that have more disasters is some of their residents actually volunteer when necessary. So do you have people within your communities that you could ask to be volunteers where appropriate to stand into some of these roles that are able and willing? It's been very successful for some of the other PHAs. It's something to consider, and as long as you're updating this annually and it's not Lewis from 5 years ago who you haven't seen in 4, it's effective and efficient, right? It gets you something started, and sometimes they just need something to do. So if you can give them something to do that makes them feel like they're contributing, that can also be very empowering.
Yeah, especially if you have a residence council that's already organized, they're empowered leadership, right? And especially one disaster, there was in central Louisiana, a hurricane that hit, and the people evacuated to largely to Monroe, Louisiana, up in northeast Louisiana. There was a resident who was giving the reports to the people who stayed back in the community, who worked with the housing authority on who was in the shelter when somebody's relative came to pick them up and take them out, right? And they were able to connect with and identify where different people were going, because that person was keeping track of, well, what's your name and where you going, where you taking this person, right? So, yeah.
You give someone power.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's true, and again, it's all about empowering the people around you and identifying your resources. So I think that's very important. Same thing with figuring out how you're going to communicate. Again, if you put a name here, they're more likely to be held accountable and responsible for it. Whether it's putting out the information, whether it's going around and asking everyone to hand them the plan when you create it, and going around and handing it to each of the residents or each of the landlords and saying, you want to sign this sheet that you got your copy? It's the little things to just holding people accountable. Next pages, you'll see a central records management checklist. Ron touched on some of the documents that are required, but making sure that you're just thinking these things through. I'm sure it's very easy to say, no duh, Brittany, these things make sense. Well, have you done it? I mean, that's just as easy as a question to me, making sure, not only have you done it, do you have your policies? Do you have forms to track your staff hours? Is there a way you can access it if everything is burned? And if there's not, whether it's Google Sheets, whether it's other shared drives, If you do not, it might be something you want to look towards, especially between the earthquakes and the wildfires that we're talking about here
And
today.
one of the things on tracking staff hours, and this factors into FEMA public assistance,
Does.
is tracking what the staff are working on following the disaster, because some of the disaster-related time and expenses that you have, not just for the time, but equipment that you use, those things could be reimbursable under FEMA public assistance. But if you don't have a code in your time tracking system already for that, then how will people go about tracking that time so that you all have really good auditable records that then would make it easier for you all to get the reimbursements that you would get for having people do those activities?
Very true. Same thing with emergency contact information, whether it's your insurance, your utilities, law enforcement, emergency relief agencies. Ron highlighted this a little bit earlier, that he learned he was not the POC for something he thought he should be the POC for, or one of the options. So having these conversations, calling the appropriate entities, utilities, insurance companies, ensuring that you have the up-to-date information, the policy numbers, your account numbers, and making sure that the appropriate people could access these accounts as necessary. Emergency relief agencies, or those VOADs or COADs we talked about. Who's active in your local area? Is there a United Way? United Way also usually has a statewide number. It's usually 511 or 211 for resources, but they also have a disaster branch, so with funding that's available. Right here we have examples of American Red Cross and Catholic Charities, not that they're necessarily preferred or endorsed, they're just examples. And then some, again, more Q&A when it comes to communications planning questionnaires, to make sure that you're just thinking through these questions and you're answering them, and if you don't have an answer, maybe having these conversations within your team. So I'm going to actually take a pause and give us a 15-minute breather to stand now that everyone has had lunch and we've finished out disaster readiness, and we'll come back and talk about disaster response. And for the Zoom team members, so that will be 2:35 Pacific.